As entrepreneurs, we all have a reason why we chose to leave our 9 to 5 for an 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. I'm here to capture those stories of why we all hustle and grind for our companies. Ed is a founder and CEO of workplace neurodiversity experts Uptimize and the author of the #1 Amazon bestseller, A Hidden Force, Unlocking the Potential of Neurodiversity at Work. Born and raised in London and educated at Oxford, Ed founded Uptimize, recognizing the need and potential for organizations to embrace neurodiversity, driven in part by his own experience of a traumatic brain injury. His role with Uptimize has afforded him unique insights and connections with pioneers in the neurodiversity at work field across the world, and he is now a frequent speaker on the topic. He and Uptimize have been featured by outlets including the BBC, Inc.com, People Management Magazine, HR.com, Great Place to Work, and the Financial Times. Ed, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate it. You live in this world that really fascinates me. And it's not just because my mom was a neuropsychologist and I love how the brain works, but also having been in training for almost 2 decades at this point, this is something that we saw was neurodiversity. And it's this term that's used and a lot of people might or might not know what it is. And I think it's incredibly relevant to small businesses and entrepreneurs as well. So I'm really happy to have you on here today so we could talk about something that, is something I really appreciate. So thank you so much for being here. I really
Thank you
appreciate
for
it.
having me. So it's a real pleasure. Looking forward to this.
Awesome. So let's start off first. And we were talking a little bit about this before the show, but what is neurodiversity? I know it's a buzzword, but let's define that first and start there.
Yeah, it is a buzzword, but at the
Mhm.
same time, lots of people are still quite unfamiliar with it.
Mhm.
And there are people who, I dare say, use it, but use it slightly wrong.
Mhm.
So it is a good place to start. Neurodiversity just means that we're all wired differently. There's no one normal human brain. Everybody thinks, processes information, experiences the world in their own unique way. So we think about a team, for example, regardless of how people, as we say, neuro-identify, if they have a conscious identity as neurotypical or autistic or ADHD or dyslexic, everybody's different in terms of how they like to communicate, how they like to problem solve, their sensory experience, how they learn, to your point about learning. And we just really, as societies and then also as companies, we haven't paid enough attention to this and this whole kind of concept and idea, even though it's just a fundamental fact of who we are,
Mhm.
is only now being kind of unfurled and truly given recognition.
Mhm. And it's something that we hear this big fancy word, but we do this as entrepreneurs. That's where a visionary integrator came from. This is the visionary has this one way. They're different, neurodiverse from an implementer is really good about saying you have 1,000 really good, 1,000 really good ideas. Which two are we going to do now?
Totally,
That
yeah. And I was saying to
neurodiversity.
you offline, we've all had these moments. I think, well, we've all worked in teams, right? So we've all had moments. Now, even if we weren't surfacing this stuff, and we can talk about that and why we think that's a good idea in terms of being able to up your chances of positive collaboration and reduce the chances of low team synergy. Even if we haven't been doing that in the past, which generally we haven't, we've all had moments of kind of serendipity where our thinking style and approach just kind of jived with someone we were working with, and what we achieved was greater than the sum of the parts. But what we see a lot, sadly, and I think we've all experienced this too, is times where it's the opposite, and we actually feel like we're struggling to get the best out of somebody, or they're struggling to get the best out of us, maybe your manager or somebody you're leading. And often that's because we're not digging into how their brain is actually functioning for them at work.
Mhm. And I think that's something that as entrepreneurs we can run into issues with, where it's good to have a diverse team because, and I've seen this with a lot of visionaries where they are brilliant in their lane. They're really good visionaries. They have this kind of North Star that they put that says this is where the company is going. And they often clash with their integrators because then it's just a different way of thinking. And it's hard for them to be able to turn that to be able to understand that difference and how to navigate it. What do you think about like navigating that workspace? Because it's different in entrepreneur world than it is in 9 to 5. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think entrepreneurs often go through a journey where right at the start, and there's just so much to do, they wish they had five of themselves, and then pretty quickly they wish they had five different types of thinkers, not five heads, but five right? But then, of course, that opens this great potential for diversity of thought and all that stuff. But it also opens this potential for misunderstanding and, norms that maybe work for three or four of us, but don't work for the fifth. And as a result, we're not getting the best out of them. So, I mean, a lot of this stuff is about, a lot of the stuff we teach at Uptimize. I'm the CEO of a company that provides training to help teams achieve better performance through embracing neurodiversity. A lot of the stuff we teach is around how to surface some of these preferences and how to have some of these conversations. So whoever we are, whatever our neuro identity, whether we identify as more at the typical end or more neurodivergent, to some degree, it doesn't matter. It's about, how do I work best? How do you work best? And how do we navigate those differences? And to your question, a lot of the time we're just not having those conversations. We are maybe concerned about getting it wrong. We don't know how to surface these things. And so in the end, I give you instructions like I sort of think you probably want them or think I like to give them. I never stop to ask you or the rest of my team what's actually going to work for you best.
And I've seen that happen a lot where it's just, you see the communication breakdown because you can tell they're talking about, they're on two different planets. It's just difficult to do. And we see that with teams sometimes, or we see everyone the same.
One more point about the entrepreneurial world is that, of course, everything's just moving so quick, right? And I think what we found, from some of our research is that a lot of what we call neuro inclusion, so including all different types of thinkers, is just kind of good management. It's good co-working, but some of that stuff can wrongly kind of go by the wayside if we're just in a crazy rush, right? So I just gave the example of giving instructions. Managers probably know that there's a way to give clear, specific instructions, and it just makes sense. But if you're flying around at 300 miles an hour, you say, are you working on that document? And it means I need it now. But that's not what you've said. So, is that clear?
Yeah.
There's a particular pressure, I think, in the entrepreneurial world to just to some degree to slow down and to kind of do things properly, because there's a reason why doing things properly is doing things properly. And if you don't and you cut corners, some people might be able to navigate that, but actually some people might really struggle.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to pivot for a second because that's part of the podcast is hearing how people have gotten to where they're at. And so I'd love to hear about how you got into this, because there was a TBI involved, or traumatic brain injury. And I'd like to hear how that shaped your kind of vision of neurodiversity in the workplace and what brought you to the point of wanting to get involved with neurodiversity.
Yeah, so I was actually three days into my career that I had a pretty serious car accident and brain injury, and I was then sort of not really full-time at work for the next 4 or 5 years, probably. Eventually found myself at a tech company in London, joined the leadership team after a while, and got really involved in people stuff. Not what I'd expected, but because my boss at the time, his big preoccupation, and therefore mine working for him, was how do we build a 21st century workforce? That was what was keeping him up at night, not products and all that stuff. It was sales. It was how do we build a 21st century workforce? People are the most important thing. That's our biggest expense. That's our biggest asset. How do we get the most of them? So I got involved in quite strategic diversity initiatives because of that. And then it was through that and having, some neurodivergent family and having had my own brain injury that I just started to join the dots there and think, hold on, what about brains, right? This is this huge thing that, none of us know anything about. And I was learning those terms. I mean, I'd never heard the word neurodiversity, right? I'd never talked to, of course, I'd heard about autism. I didn't have any autistic friends. And suddenly I'm talking to autistic job seekers who are clearly super talented, but struggling to get jobs because nobody understands the way they think. So that was the origin of Uptimize, really, to change that and seeing the potential in teams, not just from a sort of, CSR checkbox type approach, but really seeing if we can embrace and leverage all of the thinkers in humanity, we're going to create better teams. We're going to create better outcomes as people, as companies, and ultimately as a species.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And so now, as far as with the traumatic brain injury, what were some of the things, just as an entrepreneur with a TBI, what were some of the things that were most difficult? Like some of the things that changed?
Well, I think I had a slowing down of brain processing, which I just kind of had to get used to. It wasn't that my brain couldn't work at the same level; it just took a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely a new sense of sensory sensitivity. So I know it was worse even years ago, but struggling to work under bright lights and things like that, for example. So having a space that I could work at my own, in my own sensory world, being able to manage my own energy levels was a really big one as well, because I had a really significant brain fatigue. And I think those are things that are common to many neurodivergent people, right? That actually and those might be very different, but the point is you might have quite strong preferences in terms of where you work, how you work, when you work, how you manage your energy, right? And so on. And of course, if we're just thrown into a 9 to 5 straitjacket, well, that might work for some people, but it probably doesn't work for others. So I think that's one, and we were talking offline about how many entrepreneurs are neurodivergent. I think that's one factor, is actually the push factor of the corporate world not being particularly, as we say, neuro-inclusive, being a motivation for somebody who maybe thinks a little bit differently and has stronger preferences to think, I'm going to take the risk to go off and create something where I can actually shape my reality.
Mm-hmm. And that's something we were talking about earlier, where I think almost all entrepreneurs that I know are in some level ADHD, and that's our superpower, is being able to bring that neurodiversity to a world where I think completely differently than you do. And, kind of makes us crazy enough to change the world, in the words badly to cut apart Steve Jobs commencement speech. But that's really what it is. It's that neurodivergence, or neurodiversity, that causes us to go out and become an entrepreneur. It's that reason why we don't fit into that 9 to 5. And so that's why this world really fascinates me so much, is because we are neurodiverse. We go out and do our own thing.
Yeah, Richard Branson, ADHD, dyslexic. I mean, here's a really interesting story about this, where he was talking about, and I'm going to get it wrong, but I think he was talking about the way that he processes numbers. And basically there's quite a particular way that he takes in his business's figures, and it's not the typical way. And if it were the typical way, it wouldn't work for him. So his staff have kind of learned to communicate numbers to him in a way that works for him. And he says, that's great, but that's because I'm the head honcho, right? Now, if I'm, a junior analyst, no one's bothering to do that for me. And so no one's getting the Richard Branson that ultimately has blossomed into, one of the business icons of, our time. So it's a kind of an interesting thing. And one more point on that, there was actually a study done about 15 years ago or so around dyslexic entrepreneurs, and it found that dyslexia, so around 1 in 10 people are dyslexic. I'm sure many of you are dyslexic yourself, or know somebody who is. This study found that 30% of entrepreneurs were dyslexic, so 3 times the incident in the normal population.
Yep.
But it also found only 2% of corporate managers. Now, I think what that speaks to partly is maybe a preference to do one's own thing, as we said, but it also speaks to this fear culture in the corporate world, right? Where if you're an entrepreneur and you're building your own thing, and we have customers that do this, small companies that come to us and say, we want to build this into just who we are, how we work from the ground up. You don't get to do that if you're part of a big company where nobody's talking about this stuff, and actually stereotypes and misunderstandings just run wild.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Whereas with entrepreneur, and I think that's one of the reasons why any entrepreneur that I talk to are very strong about I wanted to do my own thing. I did not fit in the 9 to 5. It was wrong. It just felt wrong to me. I couldn't think that way. That's not how I process information. And it made complete sense, and it's nice to be validated by a study going, for me, it was just more saying, yep, you guys all have the, the indicators for this. It's nice to be validated by a study a bit, but that's a really fascinating thing to me. And for me, it was just personally getting out of the corporate world and being an entrepreneur is such a better place for me to be. And I think a lot of people feel that way too. And it's nice to have it kind of backed up with some science going, here's actually why, and here's why you thrive in this environment.
And of course, there's science as well on the creativity of neurodivergent brains as well. And so that's, something that, of course, is less well known and gets less attention than the better known challenges that some neurodivergent brains will face navigating societies and workplaces that don't suit them. But a lot of stuff recently done on what are called kind of flip side strengths, so that same brain wiring that might lead to some challenges is actually leading to all these positives as well, in terms of, visionary thinking, creativity, pattern matching, all of that stuff that's pretty powerful when we start trying to strategize and, build a company.
Yeah. And I've seen some folks that were, especially in the IT industry, that I've seen some folks who were neurodivergent and on the autism spectrum who are brilliant programmers. I mean, that's for some reason, that's like the one career that's really good. And they had been in the corporate world and it didn't work well for a lot of reasons. I mean, I think I heard an autistic person once say, I really wish job interviews were more straightforward, not a whole bunch of social positioning. It's just tell me to do the job and set me in a corner and let me do my thing. I don't want to deal with this.
Well, that's the perfect example, isn't it? Because if you're, interviews as a kind of social test are so much the norm, and that's a great example of a norm that works for some people, doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
If we're using face-to-face interviews for, let's say, a programmer, when how much is a programmer talking in a kind of unpredictable social context? Not much, right? It's a pretty poor way of testing, is somebody a good programmer or not?
Yeah. And I think that the entrepreneur side of things could actually be very good for somebody who is very neurodivergent, because then get them in front of a really good, strong visionary leader, and this allows them to go out and do their own thing and work in a structure that's very different than what they would get in a 9 to 5. And I've seen that work really well. And it was nice to see that people that would not normally function well in a 9 to 5 traditional role now have the structure that they need, but also have the freedom to be able to have, to do things the way that they want to, as long as they get the end goal done. That's all that matters. And it's nice to see that as well. Yeah. Huh. So now let's go back onto Uptimize, because I know it's your company. And I want to learn a little bit more about, what you do, like from an entrepreneurial standpoint, because that's a lot of what the listeners are going to be entrepreneurs with smaller businesses. What have you found works well? What specifically does Uptimize do to help, especially startup stage companies? So, with like 5-6 people and your job titles are yes, all of the things.
Yeah. So I think we work with a lot of different types of teams, primarily in the corporate world, but we've worked with military, we've worked with police forces, we've worked with, nonprofits, government. To some degree, teams are teams. I think what's nice in a small company is the team is the team, right? And that's who you are. So obviously that team is absolutely critical. That one team's absolutely critical. I like to think in a contrast about a team that kind of doesn't get this and a team that does, and explore kind of what the differences are. And I think what we do at Uptimize is kind of, help you create the second type and help you be the second type of team. So typical teams, I hate to say it, and we like to think teams of the past, but there's a lot of teams in the present that still fall into this category. Nobody's thinking about the fact that the way they work is particularly different from other people. People use the old adage, treat people like you'd like to be treated yourself. Well, that's good in terms of politeness, but that's not actually that good if the person works totally differently from you. They run inefficient meetings. They miss out on talent because they don't know how to interview and assess different types of strengths profiles. They get confused and concerned when people share that they're a bit different from them and they don't know how to react. So, that's a long list, but that's sadly a typical team. And you know, psychological safety is a big, you know, been a big buzzword now for, gosh, 15 years plus. Reality of most teams is it's terrible because people don't feel confident sharing who they are and sharing their ideas and so on. So it doesn't have to be like that. And we can have a team where we have a natural enthusiasm for the fact that our brains all work differently. Of course, that's just a fact. We know that. We have a lexicon, we have a means of surfacing and discussing and sharing that in a way that we can start putting people in a position to be successful. We can start communicating, like I said, having meetings in a way that actually gets bang for buck. We can attract different types of thinkers who know in our team they're going to be able to be successful, and so on. So, you know, we have a platform, we do workshops all around basically building awareness and then equipping people, whatever your role, to create that second type of team through this awareness of neurodiversity and neuroinclusion.
Because I think all of us have been in that situation where you're listening to somebody in a small group and you're going, what language are you speaking? I hear English, but it makes no sense to me. I think it's a clear indication that there's some neurodiversity issues, because it's like it makes perfect sense to the visionary, and the people around them are like,
totally. And look at the frustrations in a team where people think, gosh, you know, this person's working different time or communicating in a way that doesn't suit me, or interrupting is a huge one. I mean, some people thrive off that, but a lot of people don't. And so, you know, if your team is just constantly pinging each other, you know, I would guarantee, and there's been studies on this as well, I would guarantee that, you know, 3/5 of your team is probably super underproductive because of that. And you haven't checked to see, you know, does that work for them? I've learned that with my colleagues. You know, one of my colleagues, I've learned, you know, do not interrupt him unless you absolutely have to. Doesn't matter that I want to know something. I'm gonna, you know, significantly damage his morning's work if I do this. So wait till lunchtime. You know?
Or especially, like, there are some people where I am on a task and multitasking is not something they do well, where if, as you know, especially with small startups where you do everything, it's hard to not have that process interrupt as well, where it's, you know, don't interrupt him if he's doing something, if he's in deep work. We don't, unless there's a fire in the building or something. Don't interrupt.
I think that's, I mean, there's so much of this stuff overlaps with other stuff that's happening in the workplace. There's a big trend towards intentional hiring, right? So not just hiring based on rapport and culture fit, but hiring people who genuinely fit the role. I mean, you know, this ties into that. It ties into a lot of different threads like this that I think are sort of trends of leadership, trends of teamwork, and actually neurodiversity underpins a lot of it.
Interesting. So one thing I'd like to do is, if you have somebody who is in, you know, their newer company, small entrepreneur company, startup, what is one piece of advice you could give them, like something that you can give them to be able to do, like, does, you know, disk testing work or some other thing, to help them at least see that there's a problem? So, or, you know, what's one thing that you can say that kind of nudge them in the direction of, I need to really, this isn't just a buzzword woo-woo stuff, I really need to look at this?
Yeah, do a survey, take a show of hands. Doesn't matter, it could be informal. Just come up with 5 questions or come up with 20 questions. You know, how do you like to communicate when you know, you have a problem? How do you want people communicating with you? How, if we're building a strategy, how would you best like to contribute? Would you like to contribute ahead of time and have people digest your ideas? Would you like to be at a virtual whiteboard, visual, verbal? Would you like to take everything in that everybody else has put together and have time to work it through and ask questions and contribute? You know, anything like this, right? I mean, you can ask one question like that, and you're going to get different answers, and everybody else starts looking around thinking, gosh, you know, this is quite interesting actually. And these are just basic questions about how we all work that we just don't tend to ask. And, you know, you mentioned the sort of personality test. I think, you know, one of the reasons that what we do needs to exist is because, and, you know, I actually like those more than some do. There's people in the neurodiversity community who think that they're useless. I don't think that. Because I think they start to get these conversations going.
Yeah.
But, you know, just learning that you're a visionary and I'm an integrator, to use your example earlier, that's helpful, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
But what's more helpful is the nuts and bolts of what does that actually mean for when and how we like to work and organize our work, you know, and so on. So a lot of what we do is just about getting into that detail.
Mhm. And I think when I first saw started using disc profiles to help kind of understand how people communicate, that's just the one that I know. It was I had a lot of people go, "Get out of my head." Like I feel judged and understood at once. Things like that, where it helps us to start asking those questions. I actually saw one entrepreneur. It was funny. He has on his door like a bullet points of, "Here is how you communicate with me." Action
Yeah,
oriented, short
absolutely.
sentences. This is here is how you do not
And I think that's
communicate
the
with
other thing
me.
you can do. That's the other thing you can do as a leader is you can start these conversations. You can say, and you know, I say this to my team. I'm a big picture thinker, and how that works for me is I can do detail and I like detail, but I must have the wrapper of so what? Why am I looking at this? What does it matter? What is it driving? Right. So that's how I ask them, amongst other things, to communicate with me. And I want to point out here, notice I haven't said, you know, you need to be an expert on autism, dyslexia, ADHD, right? And so those are demographics that are very much interwoven, complicated. There's a saying, you know, you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. Everybody's different. So don't go, if I can give you a don't as well as a do, don't go looking for the sort of cheat sheet of, you know, if someone's dyslexic, they're going to be good at this and bad at that, and I need to do this. That's not how people work. People are too complicated for that. So yes, and you know, one of the things we do is actually build a bit of a better understanding and familiarity with some of those terms, so people have that confidence. You know, if I was to come to you and say, Andrew, actually, I've, you know, let's say I'm dyspraxic and I'm struggling with the way you send me a spreadsheet, you know, that you have a familiarity with that.
Mhm.
But everybody's different.
Mhm. Yeah. And like for me, if you come at me with 1,000 details and don't give me the thing, I will get completely confused and frustrated. Just not the way to, I'm like you, where it's like, give me what are we doing? What's the large thing? A few details just to make some sense of how to actually implement, and then we're good. Don't come out with too much.
Totally. And if the detail drives the big thing, then you've got me interested.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So it's, you know, walk me through how this would look if it was implemented, you know, let me see the experience of, you know, and sometimes that helps with,
Right.
it often helps with me to communicate. So I 100% understand. So as we're getting towards the end of things here, I do have one question that I ask everyone. What is a book or a podcast that has had a major impact on your life?
Yeah, so I'm going to choose a sort of book film combination. If I
Nice.
made
Sure.
the film was you know, the book was made into a film. Uh,
Hmm.
I actually have, you know, from the UK, as you can tell from my accent, the most famous sort of historic relative I have, ancestor, was a guy called William Wilberforce,
Okay.
who helped to abolish the slave trade.
Hmm.
And this book, Amazing Grace, and film is
Hmm.
about his life and achievements. And he was a politician who really just dedicated his life to social causes, and that being the biggest of all. And that was a time where the slave trade and slavery was pretty much just kind of accepted as it
Hmm.
just is.
Yeah.
And it needed people, and he wasn't the only one, but it needed people like him to challenge it
Hmm.
and to change that for the world. This was the first time that anybody had said in the world, like, this is wrong, and we're going to make a stand
Hmm.
against it. So, you know, I, as a kid, I'd been aware of him, and, you know, I'd been to some events around the kind of society that, you know, promotes his memory. But there was something about reading the book and watching the film, and of course, you know, it's a film, right? It's not real. You know, the book is doing its best to bring him to life, but that does bring him to life. And seeing his whole life and how much he had this amazing sense of purpose and just how fulfilled he was through that sense of purpose, you know, I found very inspiring. And, you know, it's interesting because I haven't talked today about social impact. I think if we're serving businesses, and, you know, I'm also a business owner myself,
Hmm.
businesses exist to make money. I think you have to serve them in order to help them do that.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the reasons Uptimize exists is because we believe if we do that in our context, we can create major social impact in terms of impacting, individual lives, people who've been marginalized because the way they think isn't how society expects them to think, can start being more fulfilled, and so on. So I think seeing that, reading that, gave me that sense of how important that purpose is. And it's been something that I've tried to mirror in my much more, insubstantial way in my own career.
Awesome. And I also just wanted to point out the fact you have a book yourself, Hidden Force, Unlocking the Potential of Neurodiversity at Work. Awesome. And we'll have a link to that in the show description, so that way people can pick it up. One for Amazon, an Amazon link for it. Again, Ed, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate you being here.
Pleasure. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks again for joining us on the Hustle and Grind podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Ed, check out the link in the description.